The laces of her gown hung in two neat cuts, and Mira Ashwell stood in the servants' corridor with 30 seconds before the butler announced the first guests, and no way to enter the ballroom without them. She had not yet known, in that moment, that the Duke of Cresthollow was already at the front door, handing his coat to the footman, scanning the hall with the particular stillness of a man who expects nothing and is usually right. Had she known, she would have squared her shoulders and walked in anyway. That was the thing about Mira Ashwell. The calculation was never whether to walk through the door. Only how. She had 2 hairpins. She had 30 seconds. She had spent 7 years in this house watching her stepmother's daughters destroy small things and call it accident. And she had learned, in that time, to carry a second plan the way a careful housekeeper carries a second key. The pins went through the eyelets. The tension held. Not well. Well enough. It was the 22nd of September, the last day of her stepmother's grace period on the Ashwell estate mortgage, and if nothing changed by the quarter day, by Michaelmas, 4 days from now, the deed would pass to the trust administered by one Mr. Roderick Vane, her stepmother's solicitor, her stepmother's second cousin, and, as Mira had reason to suspect, but could not yet prove, her stepmother's instrument in a matter she could not yet lay before anyone. Not yet. The papers she needed were in a locked escritoire on the upper floor of this very house, and the key to that escritoire was on a chain around Vane's neck, and Vane was somewhere in this ballroom, and the Duke of Cresthollow, who held the original deed of trust and was the only man in 3 counties whose word on the matter would be believed, was at the front door. 4 days. She walked into the light. The ballroom of Ashwell Park had been her mother's room. Mira knew it the way she knew her own hands, the grain of the floor, the draught from the second window on the left, the chandelier that swayed a 1/4 inch whenever the kitchen door below was opened. She also knew that she was not meant to be among the guests. She was the elder Miss Ashwell, which in her stepmother's version of the world meant she was the spinster one, the useful one, the one who managed accounts and arranged seating, and then disappeared before the dancing. Her stepsisters were the beautiful Mrs. Ashwell. There was an unspoken convention, and Mira had always observed it, because observing it cost her less than fighting it, and the things she was conserving her strength for were elsewhere. She took her position near the window. Not invisible, that was no longer the strategy. Present and still and unremarkable, which was a different thing. Cecily found her within 4 minutes. Cecily was 21, fair, and genuinely lovely, and she had cut the laces with a small pair of embroidery scissors borrowed from Mira's own sewing box, which was so perfectly Cecily that Mira almost felt something like affection. Almost, Cecily's eyes went to the back of the gown, widened, and she smiled with her mouth only. "I am sorry about your gown. These old ones are so fragile." "They are. The pins are holding nicely, though. Thank you for asking." Cecily's smile did not change. The not changing of it was the tell, the way she always stilled when the expected target did not fall. Cecily had a habit of touching her own collarbone when she was recalculating. She touched it now. "Lord Vane is here." "I know. He was asking for you particularly. I imagine he was." There was a pause. Cecily opened her mouth, closed it, and then Mira heard the thing she had been waiting for. The particular hush a full room makes when a person of weight enters it, the way sound actually decreases before it rises again. She turned. The Duke of Cresthollow was not what she had expected from his correspondence. The letters had been precise, formal, and strikingly unornamented, the prose of a man who regarded words as tools and kept them clean. She had written to him twice on her mother's estate matters, receiving replies within a week each time, accurate and brief and carrying a dry courtesy that she had found, in her solitude, unexpectedly companionable. She had expected someone older, someone softer. He was perhaps 35. He stood at the room's entrance the way a question stands at the end of a sentence, quietly, with an expectation of answer. His hands were wrong for a duke, she noticed. The knuckles of his right hand had been broken at some point and healed slightly crooked. He held a glass of wine he had not asked for and was not going to drink, by the look of him. His eyes moved across the room in a methodical way that she recognized, having done it herself. He was not admiring. He was accounting. He would be leaving in 4 days for the continent. She had read it in the county notices. If the deed question was not resolved before he sailed, there would be no one withstanding to resolve it, and the mortgage would pass, and Vane would have what he had been constructing for 2 years. This she was nearly certain of. The final piece was in the escritoire. 4 days. His eyes crossed hers and stopped. She looked back. She had stopped performing smallness. This was not the moment for it. He came across the room. This was not a thing she had planned for, and she felt the room notice it, felt the particular recalibration of a crowd watching a deviation from the expected script, felt Cecily go very still behind her. He stopped at a courteous distance and said, without preamble, "You are Miss Ashwell. You wrote to me about the Henley Trust provision." "I did." "In August, and again in September." "You answered both. I remember. You write better than most of my solicitors. That is either a compliment to me or an indictment of your solicitors. Both, I think." He looked at the window behind her, then back. "I was told there was no elder Miss Ashwell, that the family consisted of Mrs. Ashwell and her 2 daughters. Mira said nothing for a moment, because what she was being handed was the exact opening she needed, and she wanted to pick it up carefully. My stepmother is quite precise in her distinctions. I am my mother's daughter, not hers. The Ashwell blood is mine. The Ashwell name was, in her version, merely borrowed for convenience. Something shifted in his face. Not sympathy. She would not have wanted sympathy, but the look of a man who has added a number and found the sum unexpectedly significant. "I see." Which she thought meant rather more than 2 words. Across the room, Roderick Vane was watching them with a glass held at his lips and no movement behind his eyes at all. He was immaculate in the way of men who had always been immaculate. A studied stillness, a coat without a crease, dark hair that stayed precisely where it was placed. He had a habit of smoothing his cufflink with his thumb when he was calculating. He was doing it now, slow and regular as a clock. Mira had catalogued this. She had catalogued most of him, these 2 years past. It was the most useful thing she had ever done with her time at the edge of rooms. "There is something I must tell you. Not here, not tonight, but within the next 2 days, before you leave for the continent, if you would grant me an hour. There is a matter with the deed that I believe you need to see." She stopped. "I cannot show you yet what I mean. I am not entirely able to lay it before you in full, not without something I do not yet have in my hand. But I know where it is." He was watching her with the expression of a man who does not say what he is thinking, and has not for some time. That is a confident statement from someone who has just told me her standing in this household is disputed. "Yes, it is." Another pause. The room moved around them, neither moved. His broken-knuckled hand turned the untouched glass once, a slow rotation. She read it as consideration, not dismissal. She waited. "Day after tomorrow, 10 in the morning. I will be at the Crest Hollow Lodge on the East Road. Bring what you have, and I will make my own determination." "Thank you," she said, and meant it so precisely that she felt the precision in her chest. She did not look at Vane on her way back to the window. She did not need to. She had already seen the thumb still on the cufflink. The evening passed without incident, which was its own kind of event. Mira stood at her window and worked the numbers she knew. Vane had access to the estate's financial records because her stepmother had placed them in his keeping 3 years ago, after Mira's father died. He had also, in the past 18 months, served as the notary on 2 documents that had simplified the mortgage instruments in ways her stepmother had been pleased to sign without reading carefully. Mira had read them. She had read them 3 times. And she was not a solicitor, but she was the daughter of a man who had taught her to keep accounts as early as she could hold a pen, and she knew the shape of a number that had been moved. She simply could not prove it. Not without the contents of that escritoire. What she had, at present, was a letter. Her father's letter, written in the last month of his illness, addressed to her alone, kept in the inner pocket of the same valise she had carried since she was 19. It was sealed with wax and signed in her father's declining hand, and it said, among other things, that he had hidden something for her. Something that would answer any question that needed answering. In the escritoire, in a space that was not immediately apparent. And that the key was not to be trusted to anyone who had cause to want the space not opened. She had thought, when she first read it, that he might be confused, that the illness had made him obscure. She had thought that for approximately 4 days, and then she had watched Vane smooth his cufflink for the first time, and she had known better. The carriage taking the stepsisters home would leave at 11. Mira had arranged to stay. She had given herself the task of supervising the clearing of the good china, which no one would question and no one would attend to. The house would thin. She intended to go upstairs. She did not intend to be alone. "You are staying late," said a voice to her left. She had not heard him approach. This was unusual. She heard most things. He moved the way he stood, quietly, without announcement. "I have china to supervise." "You do not look like a woman who is thinking about china," she considered him. The careful version of herself, the useful, invisible version, would have given him a mild deflection and put distance between them. That version had served her purpose for 7 years. She had set it aside. "No, I am thinking about a lock." He did not ask her to explain. He turned to look at the room with her, and they stood in a silence that was not quite comfortable and not quite uncomfortable, a silence with an argument running just below it, or perhaps an understanding. She was not sure which. After a moment he said, "Vane has been watching you since I spoke to you." "I am aware." He did not look concerned. He looked interested. There is a difference. Yes, she had parsed the same distinction, standing 20 feet from Vane all evening, watching the thumb on the cufflink. Concerned men made errors. Interested men made plans. He thinks I have less than I have, or that even if I have it, I cannot place it before anyone withstanding in time. And can you? That depends on what I find upstairs, and whether you are at the East Lodge at 10 on Thursday. The look he gave her was long and level, and she read in it, correctly, she thought, the thing he had not said, that he was not in the habit of making appointments and then failing to keep them. It was a quiet rebuke and a quiet promise at once. "I will be there." Crest Hollow left an hour before the final guests, and Mira watched him go with the feeling of a surgeon watching a necessary instrument laid out for mourning, grateful, braced. Not yet at the hard part. The house emptied. She counted the windows going dark. The upper corridor was quiet and cold. Mira carried her own candle, which she preferred to the oil lamp the housekeeper had offered her. It was lighter, more directable, and her hands were steadier than the housekeeper's would have been at this hour. The escritoire was in what had been her father's private study, unused since his death. The door locked with the estate key she kept on her own ring because no one had thought to ask for it back. She had 60 seconds inside the room before she heard the step on the stair. It was not the housekeeper. The housekeeper wore soft shoes and had a particular creaking gait. This step was measured, boot-heeled, deliberate, a man who wanted her to hear him coming. She kept her hands still. She kept her face toward the escritoire. She was looking at the interior of the right-hand drawer, which her father had described in terms she had always read as metaphorical and now understood to be architectural. There was a false bottom, thin as a playing card, pressed flush. Her fingernail found the edge. Miss Ashwell. Vane's voice from the doorway, soft and mild as it always was. He was the kind of man whose gentleness was a precise instrument. You are up very late. So are you. She lifted the false bottom. Beneath it was a folded document, thick with age, sealed with her father's crest, addressed in his writing to the Duke of Crest Hollow. Beneath that was a second paper, smaller, in a hand she did not immediately recognize. My father's papers. There was a pause. It had a different texture than his earlier pauses of the evening. A texture of calculation crossing into something colder. Those are estate documents. They are under my custodianship. The custodianship document you drafted was signed by my stepmother. My stepmother is the surviving spouse. She is not the estate trustee. My father's will vested that trust in the Duke of Crest Hollow's office, not in a custodian of her appointment. She turned now. You know that. You drafted that will. Vane's face was still beautiful and still immaculate and carried nothing she could read except the one thing she could always read in him, the arithmetic running underneath. He smoothed his cufflink. The codicil supersedes the will. There is no codicil. There is. Signed a week before your father died. I witnessed it myself. And there it was. She had expected it, the way you expect a step to be missing when the count has always been wrong. I would like to see it. I have it in safekeeping. I would like to see it. She placed them flat against her chest inside her shawl. Her hands did not shake. It required effort she would not show him. They were my father's. The one addressed to the Duke is for the Duke. The other, she had had time to read 3 lines of the other. The other is in my father's hand as well, though he did not sign it. I intend to read it. Miss Ashwell, you are a woman with no legal standing in this house, no property, and no corroboration. What you hold is whatever you have decided it is. What I hold is a properly witnessed document. I am prepared to be generous. He paused. Your stepmother would see you placed well. A settlement. Quiet. You would lack for nothing. Here it was then, the bribe, delivered in the softest voice in the room. She thought of the Michaelma estate, 4 days away. She thought of the East Lodge, 2 days away. She thought of her father's handwriting on the packet, and the 3 lines she had read, and the thing they had begun to tell her, and she thought of how long a year of quiet comfort would last against what she had already spent. No, thank you. Vane looked at her for a long moment. Then the arithmetic reached its final answer, and his expression settled into something she had not seen before. Not calculation, not pleasantness. Patience, the patience of a man who has another option and is not required to use this one today. Sleep well, he said, and left. She stood in the dark study for the time it took her to count 60 breaths. Then she took the candle and the papers and went to her room and locked the door with the small brass bolt. And she sat at her writing table, and she read. Her stepmother did not speak to her at breakfast. This was not unusual. What was unusual was Cecily's silence, which had a different quality than her customary selective attention. a tight, watchful quality. Cecily's eyes moving between Mira and the door. Cecily's hand coming twice to her collarbone and retreating. Vane had spoken to someone. Mira ate her toast and did not alter her pace and said, when her stepmother asked if she had slept, "Very well, thank you," which was a lie of the most useful kind. The day was a problem she had already solved. She needed one more thing. She needed a witness who could speak to the second paper's origins. And she thought, she was nearly certain, she knew who that witness was. His name was Foskett. He was 71 years old and had been her father's head land steward for 30 years, and had retired to a cottage on the estate's north boundary. And he had, at her father's death, come to Mira privately and pressed her hand and said, "The man told me things, miss. If the day ever comes." And Mira had filed this away in the ledger she kept of all the things she could not yet use. And today, the day had come. She sent a message by the youngest stable boy, who was 11 and adored her because she had spent one afternoon teaching him to figure. And she did not put anything in the message she could not afford to have seen. She put, "The East Lodge, Thursday at 10. Please come if you are well enough." He was well enough. The boy returned with a yes folded in the same paper. The remaining day she spent on the accounts. This was not calculation, or rather it was, but it was also simply what she did. The house ran because Mira ran it, and it would continue to run until the quarter day or until whatever was coming arrived. And in the meantime, the lemons needed counting, and the larder inventory was 3 days late. She did these things. It calmed her the way arithmetic had always calmed her, the way the correct sum had always felt like a hand pressed firmly between her shoulder blades. Crest Hollow came to find her in the estate room at 4 in the afternoon. She looked up. He stood in the doorway of the estate room as though uncertain he had the correct door, looking at the ledgers spread across the table, at her ink-stained fingers, at the column she was still holding a place in with her pen. She had not been expecting him. This was unusual. "You were not at the morning room." "I don't use the morning room." She set down the pen. "Was I meant to be?" "I was told there would be." He came into the room and looked at the ledgers. Not performatively, he actually read. She could see him tracking numbers down a column. "These are the estate accounts?" "Yes." "May I?" He did not frame it as a question. He took the chair on the other side of the table, and she turned the nearest ledger so he could read it. And for 20 minutes, neither of them spoke. She watched him the way she watched all faces, cataloging the micro-adjustments, the small recalibrations of expression. At the third page, he made a sound that was not quite a word. "The Henley outholding revenue. It was reduced by a third the year before last. The repair costs against it are fabricated, or at minimum, substantially inflated." He looked up. "I believe so. I believe the actual repair invoices, if they can be produced, will not match these entries." She paused. "The invoices are in the escritoire." They were in the escritoire. She was aware this was not a complete sentence. "I found some papers last night, not the invoices, but things that bear on the invoices." He waited. His hands were flat on the table, very still. "I cannot show you until tomorrow, not until I have Foskett with me. There is a paper in my father's hand that you need to hear him corroborate before I can ask you to credit it." "What does it say?" She looked at him. The version of her that had always moved through rooms unseen would not have answered this. The version she was now, sitting in her mother's estate room, with 2 days left, and Vane in this house, said, "It says that my stepmother and Vane asked my father to sign a codicil in his last week, and that he refused, that he wrote down the refusal and gave the paper to Foskett to keep, and that the codicil Vane will produce tomorrow is," she stopped, "because precision mattered here. I believe it is a forgery. My father's hand, poorly done. I have seen enough of his papers to know the difference. I believe tomorrow you will see the same difference." The stillness of him had changed. He was very careful now, the careful of a man who has understood something and is weighing it against what he already knows. That is a serious accusation. Yes, if Foskett cannot corroborate it. If Foskett cannot corroborate it, then I have a theory and a feeling and 2 papers that could be read either way. I know that. I am not asking you to believe it today. I am asking you to come tomorrow and look. A pause. Long enough that she heard the kitchen door below them and felt the chandelier sway its 1/4 inch. His right hand turned, and she saw the broken-knuckled fingers spread against the table's surface, and then settle. It was the gesture of a man making a decision. "I will come." He did not leave immediately, which she had expected him to do. He sat, and she returned to her column, and the room held the particular ease of 2 people who are comfortable in their own silence. After a time he said, "Your father taught you this." It was not a question. Yes, he used to say the accounts were honest when people were not, that the number was always trying to tell you something. She looked at the column. He was right about that. Was he a happy man? It surprised her. She was not often surprised. She put down the pen for the 2nd time that afternoon and thought about it the way it deserved to be thought about. I think he was worried. He married poorly the 2nd time, and I think he knew it long before he died, and I think the knowing was not a happiness. She paused, but the land made him happy, the work of it, and I was a consolation to him, I believe. At least he told me so, and he was not a man who said things he did not mean. There was a silence, and in it she heard the thing he did not say, and she thought it was something about grief, but she could not be certain. "Your father's first wife. Was she well thought of?" "Very. She managed this estate for 12 years before I was old enough to do it. The tenants still talk about her." She looked at the window. The afternoon light was the particular gold of late September, the gold that always felt to her like a held note, like something about to resolve. This room was hers. He looked at the room. She let him. "I'm sorry, so am I, but here we are in it, and the accounts still need finishing." His first real laugh surprised them both. It was short, and it had an edge of rust in it, like something long hinged that had opened unexpectedly. She filed it as a fact. He gathered himself back to composure almost immediately, but the composure was different afterward, lighter in some small way she didn't have a word for. He left at 5. She finished the column and sealed the papers inside her valise and went to the window and watched the sky go amber over her mother's fields, and she did not let herself think yet about Thursday. Tonight was still Wednesday, and Wednesday needed to be survived, and surviving was the work she knew how to do. Vane came to her room at 9. He knocked, which was almost courteous. She opened the door because she had known he was coming. She had heard his boot heel on the 3rd stair from the top, which was the one that spoke, and because she wanted him to see that she was not afraid of the knock. "I want to make a different offer." She waited. "Not a settlement, an exchange. You give me what you found in the escritoire. I give you clear title to the North Cottage and 100 a year. Your own house, your own money. Nothing to do with this estate or anyone in it." He said it gently. "You could be free of all of it." It was a better offer. She acknowledged this to herself because she did not believe in lying to herself about numbers. It was a genuinely better offer. 100 a year was sufficient. The north cottage was hers, by right of her mother's specific bequest in any event, which Vane presumably hoped she had not read carefully enough to know. But the north cottage was also 30 minutes' ride from the estate and from the tenants and from the accounts and from this window with its September light. She thought of her father's hand in the column, moving down the page, careful, honest, trying to tell her something. She thought of the Henley outholding rents reduced by a third, and the tenants who had paid them and where that third had gone. No, thank you. He looked at her for a long moment, really looked, which he rarely did. He usually looked at the space adjacent to a person as though they were furniture that might be moved. Now he looked at her face. The thumb moved on the cufflink. You know I will dispute every paper you produce. I have standing. I have the codicil. You have a paper that will be compared to my father's actual correspondence by a man who read it every week for 30 years. A long pause. The calculation ran. Foskett. He had not known about Foskett. She could see it. The single adjustment in the otherwise composed face. The almost imperceptible recalibration. He had known about the papers. He had not known about the witness. And now he was doing what methodical, careful, long-planning men did when a variable changed. He was updating. And the updating took a moment she could see. And in that moment she was grateful for every hour she had spent watching him from the edge of rooms. He recovered, of course. He always recovered. "Good night, Miss Ashwell," he said, and left. She listened to his heels on the stair all the way down. She did not sleep much. This was not fear, or not only fear. It was the particular wakefulness of a woman who has arranged everything she can arrange and must now wait for the morning to tell her whether she has arranged enough. She lay in the dark and held the valise to her chest and counted. The papers, the sealed packet for the Duke, Foskett's message, the accounts in her own hand. A chain of proof. Each link held. She ran it again. It held again. She was in the study for the second time before dawn. She needed the invoices. If Crest Hollow was going to place a judgment on altered figures, she needed him to see the alteration in the figure's own terms, the false entries against the actual costs of the work that had been done. The invoices were, she thought, in the lower left drawer, which Vane's search had not reached the night before. She had 20 minutes before the house stirred. The lower left drawer held the invoices. It also held a bundle of letters, folded small, tied with a ribbon she recognized. Her father's letters to her mother, kept here all this time, 30 years of them. She did not take those. She took the invoices. She stood in the study with her candle, and she did not cry, because crying was not useful, and she was her father's daughter to the last. She was at her writing table when she heard Cecily on the landing. Cecily did not knock. Cecily opened the door, which meant she had a key, which Mira filed as information she should have confirmed earlier. Cecily was in her wrapper with her hair loose and her face without its careful arrangement, and she was briefly more honest than Mira had seen her in 6 years. She stood in the doorway and looked at the valise and the papers and the candle, and she said, with a flatness that had no performance in it, "Vane is going to the lodge before you." Mira went still. How early? He left half an hour ago. Mama sent him. He has, there is a letter. For the Duke. Mama signed it, saying that you have been unstable. Since Papa died. She stopped. I read it. Silence. Mira looked at her stepsister in the candlelight and read her the only way she knew how to read anyone, from the hands and the eyes and what the mouth did when it was trying not to do anything. Cecily was 21 and lovely, and had been given every advantage Mira had been denied, and had used those advantages mostly to make Mira's life smaller. She was also, right now, looking at Mira's face with an expression that was not triumph and not malice. It was something closer to reckoning. "Why are you telling me?" A long pause. "He kept some of the money from the Henley rents. Mama thought she was getting all of it. A beat. She found out last week." Mira sat with this. The arithmetic was, as always, trying to tell her something, and what it was telling her was that Vane had been running 2 schemes with one set of documents, and one of his principals had just discovered she was not the sole beneficiary. She thought of Cecily's hand on the collarbone, recalculating all those months, and she thought of a woman who had done a wrong thing for insufficient return and was standing in her stepdaughter's doorway at 5 a.m. in her wrapper. "Get dressed. You are coming with me." The east road in early September dawn had a quality of held breath, the mist still lying along the ditch lines, the first birds not yet committed to their full morning statement, the light coming from somewhere below the horizon and casting everything in a pale that was not quite gray and not quite gold. Mira drove the gig herself. Cecily sat beside her without speaking. They had not spoken since the house, and the silence was the most honest communication they had managed in 6 years. She could see the lodge chimney as they cleared the hill's brow. There was smoke, and 2 horses in the yard, and a 3rd horse she did not recognize being walked by a groom. The 3rd horse was tall and dark and had the bearing of an animal that traveled fast and often. She brought the gig to the yard and gave the reins to the boy, and she went to the door and opened it without knocking, because it was 7 minutes past 10, and every minute was a minute of Vane's head start, and she was done being quiet. The lodge's front room was a large, low-beamed space set for a meeting, a table, 4 chairs, a fire. Crest Hollow stood at the mantel. At the table sat Foskett, looking smaller than she remembered and more determined, and in the 4th chair, with the particular posture of a man who has recently spoken and expects to go on speaking, sat Vane. Vane looked at her with a mild courtesy that cost him nothing. "Miss Ashwell, I was hoping you would be timely. Good morning." She looked at Crest Hollow. He was watching her with the careful expression, the one that had nothing in it she could read yet. She thought, he has heard Vane's version. She did not know for how long. "I have the papers." Lord Vane was explaining, Crest Hollow said, neutrally, that you have been under significant strain since your father's death, and that some of your recent interpretations of estate documents may benefit from, with respect. Would you let me show you what I have before drawing any determination? A pause. "Yes, show me." She placed the invoices on the table first. She went through them against the ledger entries she had carried in her own hand, column by column, in the quiet voice she used for accounts, which was different from any other voice she used. She did not look at Vane. She looked at the paper and she let the numbers speak, and the numbers said what numbers always said when they had been altered. They said it in the small ways, in the round sums where specific ones should be, in the vendor names that repeated too evenly, in the totals that agreed perfectly where real receipts were always imperfect. Vane's interjections were gentle and consistent, a clerical error here, a consolidated billing there, a practice common in estate accounting. He was good. She had expected him to be good. She set the invoices aside. She placed before Crest Hollow the sealed packet with his name on it, in her father's hand. "My father left this for you. In the escritoire, beneath a false floor in the right drawer. I found it 2 nights ago." Crest Hollow looked at the seal. He looked at the handwriting on the packet's face. He broke the seal and he read in silence. His expression did not change in any way that she could name, which was its own kind of tell. "There is a document in this packet, in your father's hand, stating that a codicil was proposed to him and that he declined to sign it. He looked up, signed by your father and witnessed by Foskett, yes, Foskett, from his chair, with the simplicity of a man who has been waiting a year to say it. I witnessed the refusal. October 3rd, the year before last. Mr. Ashwell called me to his room, wrote it out himself, and I signed my name to it, and he pressed the seal, and I watched him place it in the writing desk. And he told me where. A pause. He told me if a codicil ever appeared, to say that it was a lie, because he had refused to make one. Vane's face was still immaculate, still composed. The thumb was moving on the cufflink with the slow regularity of a mechanism that did not know, yet it had wound down. Foskett is elderly. And he was not present at the signing of the actual codicil. He cannot speak to what he did not witness. He can speak to what he witnessed in its place. Crest Hollow set the packet down. Mr. Vane, I should like to see this codicil. A pause. I would need to retrieve it from, you have it with you. You came here to produce it. You have been carrying it for 2 years against this moment. She looked at him directly for the first time that morning. Show us. Another pause. The arithmetic ran for the last time. And Roderick Vane, who had been, all his life, the beautiful, immaculate man who spoke most gently when most cruel, who had built his scheme over years with the patience of a craftsman, who had planned for every variable he could see, reached into his coat and produced a folded paper and placed it on the table. Crest Hollow picked it up. He read it. He set beside it the packet from the escritoire, open to her father's handwriting. He held them both in the light from the south window. Mira saw his eyes move between them, carefully, twice. Then he passed both to Foskett. Foskett read them, and the old man's face did what the old man's face would not have done a year ago. It settled into something sad and resigned and confirmed the formation of the letter A. Mr. Ashwell made it in a particular way, always the crossbar set low, the right leg longer. My name, here, he pointed, without looking at Vane, is not my name. The letters are my letters. The shape is not my shape. The room was quiet. Cecily, in the doorway where she had stood this entire time without speaking, said, in a voice that had none of its usual management, Lord Vane. When did you begin skimming from the Henley receipts? My mother wishes to know. She said it with a flatness that was not cruelty and not accusation. It was the voice of a woman asking an arithmetic question. Vane looked at Cecily, and something in his face moved, finally, not the mild courtesy, not the calculating patience, something older. He had loved Cecily's mother, Mira thought suddenly, and with the thought came the accompanying understanding, not the right way, and not wisely, and he had built the scheme as much to keep himself in her orbit as to profit from it, and the orbit had shifted, and here he was in the light in front of witnesses. The thumb stopped on the cufflink. He looked at the table. 3 years ago. The first year was a mistake. The next 2 were insufficient courage to correct it. He stopped. I am sorry, Cecily. Tell your mother I am sorry. No one said anything for a moment. Crest Hollow gathered the papers. He did it methodically, squaring the edges, setting them in an order that made sense to him. Mr. Vane, I am not going to bring this before a court. The document will be retracted. The estate deed will be reaffirmed in its correct legal disposition, and the Henley accounts will be reconciled with an auditor of my appointment. You will resign your custodianship today and vacate any position connected to the Ashwell estate by Friday. If you comply with all of this, I will not pursue the matter further. A pause. There are people in this matter who are not you, who would be harmed by a public proceeding. I am not protecting you. I am protecting them." Vane looked at Cresthollow for a long moment, and then he looked at Mira, and she looked back without triumph, because triumph was not what she felt. What she felt was the particular cost awareness of a woman at the end of a thing that has taken years, standing in the light with all its receipts. She felt sorry for him, in the way you feel sorry for someone who has wasted something that had at its root a real capacity for better. "Yes, I understand." He stood and straightened his coat, and the immaculateness of him was somewhat diminished now, not from dishevelment, but from transparency. He went to the door and he paused, not looking back, and he said to the room in general, "She was always better at the accounts than I was. I knew it from the first year." And then he went. Foskett coughed. It was the cough of a man who has been holding something for a very long time and has just been able to put it down. He looked at Mira with eyes that were wet, being ignored with tremendous dignity, and she crossed to him and took his hand and pressed it the way he had pressed hers, and he said you'd manage it, and she said he would say that, and it cost her more than she had expected. Cecily, still in the doorway, said, "I will drive us back, if you like." A pause. "You look tired." "I am tired," which was the most honest thing she had said to Cecily in 6 years. The lodge emptied. The fire burned. Mira turned to the window. Cresthollow was still at the table. She had been aware of him all morning in the particular way she had been aware of him since the ballroom, not as a variable, not as a means to an end, but as a presence, which was different, a presence with broken-knuckled hands, and the first laugh she had catalogued with the satisfaction of a solved equation. She was tired, and she was vindicated, and she was standing in a lodge on the East Road, with 4 days to Michaelmas, about to be reduced to nothing by a man who had kept his appointment, and she had not prepared for what came after the proof, because she had been spending everything on the proof. He said, without looking up from the papers, he was still squaring. "The North Cottage is yours by your mother's bequest. That is in the original will and was never touched. You know that. Yes, the estate trust passes to my office for administration, which means, in practice," he stopped. "In practice, it means you run it. That is what my office does with estates of this kind. We appoint a competent manager and sign the forms they require. That has been my father's practice, and mine." He looked up. "If you are willing." She looked at him. The careful part of her was running the numbers, the 100 a year, the North Cottage, the title, the management fee, the independence. The other part of her was standing in her mother's estate and looking at a man with honest hands in September light. "I am willing." "Thank you." A pause. Then he said, with the care of a man approaching something he is not certain will hold his weight, "I sail in 4 days. You mentioned, the matter I sail for will take perhaps 2 months, perhaps 3. He set the papers down. "I find, with some surprise, that the duration is not, that the duration feels longer than it did a week ago." He looked at her directly, which he usually did not, which she had learned meant he was about to say something he had prepared. "When I return, I would like, if it is agreeable to you, to call on you. Properly, not on estate business, a pause. That is all. I am not asking you to wait. I am not suggesting any obligation. I know what you have been through this week, and I am not placing anything additional before you. I simply want to say it plainly so you know, and then I will sail, and you will run the estate, and we will each do our work, and in 3 months we will see." She thought about her father's letter, which she had memorized in the night, the part that said, after the legal instructions, after the hiding place, in the hand of a man who knew he was running out of time. She could hear his voice in it, the careful voice he used for the columns, that she had given enough years to other people's use of her, and that he hoped she would find someone worth giving her own years to for her own reasons, freely. Marry me because you wish it. That was the only reason you would take. He went very still. She read it as shock, which she had rarely seen in him, and found she was glad she had caused it. That was... When did I say that? You did not. I was borrowing it on credit. You may have it back if it doesn't suit. She paused. It sounded like the kind of thing you would say. The second laugh was longer than the first, and had less rust in it, and when it had resolved into something quieter, he said, without any of the preparation, "Yes, it does sound like me." He looked at her with the expression she had been reading all morning, the expression of a man who finds a sum and cannot account for it, and finds he does not need to. Ask me again in 3 months, when I have done the work and you have done yours, and we can stand across the table from one another with nothing owed and nothing pending. Yes, 3 months. He held out his hand, the broken-knuckled right one, and she took it, and they shook hands like two people closing an account, which was the most romantic thing she had ever experienced, and she was her father's daughter, so she was not surprised by this. The wedding was a small affair in October, when the light came sideways through the leaves, and the North Cottage's garden was full of the season's last warmth. There were 9 guests. Foskett wept, loudly, without apology, in the manner of a man who has earned the right to weep, and the old housekeeper pressed his arm and told him to collect himself, and he said he would in a minute, and he did not, and no one minded. The vows were brief and precise, as both their temperaments required. He said hers back to her at the end, one phrase she had spoken, returned in a context that changed everything about it, and she understood with perfect clarity that she was going to be doing this the rest of her life, giving him lines he would file and return transformed, and she thought her father would have approved. Cecily received a handsome settlement, negotiated with Crest Hollow's office by Mira herself, and moved to a house in the town and found, within the year, a steady-natured man who was fond of her precisely as she was, and was surprised by this, and softened over time in the way of people who are surprised by being loved. Mira was glad of it. They were not close, but they exchanged letters at the quarter days, and the letters were honest, and that was more than either of them had managed before. Roderick Vane went to his family's property in the north and was heard of periodically, doing minor estate work for lesser families, immaculate as ever, still gentle-voiced, diminished in scope. A mutual acquaintance wrote that he had a garden he was said to tend carefully. Mira read this and filed it without comment. Foskett died in the following spring, in his cottage, in his chair by the window, having outlasted the trouble he had been keeping for 11 months, and Mira stood at his funeral in the April mud, with her husband's arm at her back, and thought about a man who had pressed her hand and said the right thing and held the right paper for the right length of time, and thought that this was all any of us could hope to do for the people we loved. The Henley outholding had its best year in 2 decades. The rents were honest, the accounts were honest, and the tenants, who had always known the difference, knew the difference. On the first anniversary of the ball, Mira was in the estate room when she heard a step on the path outside the window. She looked up. Crest Hollow came in from the garden, with his coat dusty from the east fields, the broken-knuckled hand carrying a cutting from the late rose that grew along the boundary wall, her mother's rose, the one that had been there since before Mira was born. He set it on the account table without ceremony and said the Northfield tally came out correctly. "I know. I did it this morning." He sat in the chair across from her. She returned to her column. The light came through the window at the September angle she had loved since childhood, and a bird was working in the garden outside, unhurried and specific, and she could hear the faint tick of the mantel clock, and the accounts were honest, and the room was her mother's room, and she was in it. "Do you still have the scissors?" "Which scissors?" "The embroidery scissors." Cecily returned them. "They are in the small drawer, I believe, with the spare hairpins." He did not answer immediately. She did not look up. "Why? I thought we should keep them." A record of the occasion. The quiet that followed was the best kind of quiet, the kind that had its accounts in order, all its costs known, all its sums settled and honestly kept. If this story warmed something in you, if you have ever held your composure when the room expected you to crumble, or kept a thing in trust long past the cost of keeping it, then you will understand why it had to go the way it did. The lamp was always going to be lit. It only needed someone willing to carry it into the hall. Come and sit a while if you have another story left in you this evening. There is a chair kept, and the fire has not gone down. We would love to have you with us at Hearth and Hidden Letters. Find the subscribe and keep your seat by the fire. Tell us in the comments, at which moment did you first know the accounts were going to balance? When she refused the second time, perhaps, or when he counted the days aloud and called it not a calculation. Sleep well tonight, and be careful with the ones who kept your lamp burning.